right, so I think it's time to begin. That was the bell. So we're going to be finishing the last day of creation, day 6, with man. This time we're going to be focusing mainly on the genetics of people, of you and I, and Adam and Eve. So the Bible clearly tells us that there is one man that God made from the dust of the earth, and one woman that was made from the rib of man. And that completely removes apes from the equation. But it does ask a few questions. What were their genes like? What did they look like? Does that match with what we're seeing today? Things like that. Now, our genes today can be put in what's called a karyotype. This is when we separate out all of our chromosomes in matching pairs. We have 22 chromosomes, chromosome 1A, chromosome 1B, and so on. We also have 2 sex chromosomes. Men have XY, females have XX. Now all these are stored within the nucleus of the cell, the center of the cell. We get one of these chromosomes from our father and one from our mother. And when we get them, they then shuffle. So the chromosome 1A does not have all the genes that came from dad. It will then have some genes that came from mom, because once we have them in our cells, the cell shuffles them so that there's a lot more variety in our future offspring. So instead of 1A, gene 1A, gene 2A, gene 3A, gene 4A, and so on, it's gene 1B, gene 2B, gene 3A, gene 4A, and so on. So there's a lot of shuffling there, except with the sex chromosomes. When you have 2 X's, they will shuffle. And inside the body, one of those X's is turned off. That's why, for example, in cats, you get calicos in females, because one of the X chromosomes is shut off, and which one being shut off tells us which color that fur will be. In males, though, it's a little different. The Y chromosome does not match with the X chromosome. We just group them together because they both control as far as sex and gender. But they do not shuffle. We also have a set of DNA in what's called the mitochondria of the cell, the powerhouse of the cell. And this only comes from mom, because during fertilization, all the male supplies is the nuclear material, the DNA. The cellular structure, the architecture, everything that's inside the cell is inside the egg. It all comes from mom. So the Y chromosomes only come from dad, and the mitochondrial DNA only come from mom. The X chromosomes, one comes from dad and one comes from mom. So, and those shuffle, remember that. Excuse me. So, if you were to talk with an evolutionist, they would say it is impossible to have all of mankind come from a single pair. That's because they have a number of assumptions with that. They assume that all the differences between you and I have to arise from mutation. They also assume that any pair of individuals would have a mutational load already within them. That's why today, if you try to repopulate with a single pair of any creature, humans or otherwise, after a number of generations, the mutations inherent in those genes will rise to the surface and begin to cause a number of problems, just from statistics. The inbreeding is not causing them, but they're allowing them to come to the surface. Now, these assumptions aren't needed for the biblical model, and we'll get into why that is. They just know the main difference between the approach is the assumptions. Now, as I said before, the Y chromosome only comes from dad, and the mitochondrial DNA only comes from mom. And because there is no shuffling in this, we know that all the differences between you and I, if you're a man, or you or I regardless, because we all get our mitochondria from our mom, the differences in those are purely arising from mutation. There is no shuffling in there. There is no second copy to shuffle with. And so we can then trace back to a single ancestor, and that's exactly what we find. Evolutionists call them Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve. Though they don't believe in Adam and Eve, they just call it this. And from a biblical point of view, this is not Adam and this is not Eve. Y chromosome Adam would be Noah, because he is our closest male ancestor to everyone on this earth. As far as mitochondrial Eve, It could be Eve, but most likely it is the closest female relative of the wives of Noah's sons. Remember, Noah's wife is not involved with this because she passed her mitochondrial DNA to her sons, who did not pass it on to their children. Now, having one male ancestor and one female ancestor is not required for evolutionary theory, but it is required for the biblical model. We have to have this. So if we found a second Y chromosome that does not match with the first pair, or the first Y chromosome, or a second mitochondrial DNA that does not match with any of the other mitochondrial DNA, excuse me, this would be a major push against the biblical model. Excuse me, got a little tickle in my throat. Now, the fact that we do have one male and one female ancestor for everyone on this earth is not a major push against the evolutionary theory either. Because the evolutionary theory can't allow for this. Now, to allow for it, they have to make a few alterations, a few rescue devices. They have to have a relatively small population of humans. The number is about 10,000 is what they want to say. Living, interbreeding in the same environment for hundreds of thousands of years. Statistically speaking, if you have a small population living by themselves for that long, you're going to get one male and one female ancestor, just from statistics alone. Now, this will create other problems. I mentioned before the mutation load. This would create a number of mutations, a number of problems genetically with that population. So it does allow for this finding, but it creates a number of other problems as well. Now let's talk about the mutations. There are average 3 to 5 million differences between me and you. Any random two people, 3 to 5 million different letters in our DNA. That's about 0.1% of our total genome, the total DNA that we have within us. The current measured mutation rate is about 60 mutations per generation. You will find some papers that try to give a different number. This is mainly because they are looking at differences in the evolutionary time scale and calculating it out that way. But to get this number, they've taken pedigrees, mainly in Iceland because they were very good about recording their pedigrees, and then calculating the differences in mutations in that population. So an actual empirical evidence to support that. And in 6,000 years, that mutation load, that mutation rate, could not produce all the differences between you and I. And mutation is basically in 4 main categories. There are a few others, but these are the main ones. Substitution. So let's say we had the word B-A-D, bad. Substitution. You replace the A with an E. Now you have bed. Deletion. B-A-D, bad. Now you just have add, A-D. Insertion. B-A-D goes to bade, B-A-D-E. And inversion. B-A-D, bad, goes to bada. And so, if mankind arose from a single pair 6,000 years ago, that leaves 2 options. Either Adam and Eve were homozygous, meaning they had the same genes on chromosome 1A as chromosome 1B. Or they were heterozygous, meaning that they had the same, or didn't have the same chromosomes. They had chromosome 1A genes and chromosome 1 or B genes. So different genes on each of their chromosome 1s. If they were homozygous, meaning having the same genes on each chromosome, that would mean the differences were only arising from mutation. Between you and I, those differences had to arise from mutation. Yet if they were heterozygous, having different genes on each of their chromosome 1s, then all the differences between us were simply inherited from Adam and Eve. Now let's see if this works. So if there were only 60 mutations from Adam and Eve to their children, that means genetically they would be 0.00000001. I think I got all those zeros in there. So incredibly similar. In an instance, they would be producing clones of themselves. Clones of clones of clones. So you'd have all the women looking virtually identical to Eve, and all the men were looking virtually identical to Adam. Thousands and thousands of people. This creates a number of problems logistically, does not seem like a very good design, and would not match the data we see today. So this is probably not the case. Now let's see if they were heterozygous, see if this matches. So the DNA would shuffle with each child. So Adam would give one of his chromosome 1s, Eve would give one of her chromosome 1s. This may mean that they got the same genes that Adam and Eve had on that chromosome. Or it could mean that they got the dominant. They both got chromosome 1A and chromosome 1A from Eve and Adam, meaning they had 2 copies of the same genes on that chromosome. Now remember, there's more than one chromosome, so there would still be a number of differences. But for that chromosome, they would be the same. Or if they had different chromosomes, those chromosomes would then shuffle. So now those chromosomes are no longer the same as the chromosomes found in Adam and Eve because they were shuffling. And you can see some images that depict that there.
There's a comment from online asking how the one gene from the male, one gene from the female corresponds to disorders such as Klinefelters and stuff like XXY, XXX, that sort of thing.
And so there are a number of disorders that have more than one chromosome. And those are very few, very rare. Trisomy 21, Down syndrome, that has 3 of the chromosome 21s. I believe there are 2 others that have 14 and 16 that will be born alive, but they don't last very long. I think the most is about a year. Now there are a number of genders that have, or a number of people that have multiple sex chromosomes. There are women that have XXXX, or sorry, 3 X's. Not a big problem because, again, remember, one of those is turned off, so turning off an extra one of those isn't really a problem. They're relatively normal. Now there are people that have XXY. Virtually normal, they do have some problems, but remember, turning off one of those X chromosomes is inherent in that X chromosome, so it doesn't really create that big of an issue. They can function, they can do everything. There may be some infertility and slightly different physical features, but for the vast majority, they are male because the X chromosome, the extra X chromosome they have is turned off. And there are some men that have XYY. Now, again, they are virtually identical because the Y chromosome doesn't have a lot of genes on it. Now, there are some studies that show that they may have higher testosterone, higher aggression issues, more found in prisons and stuff like that, but that's a topic for a different day. But in short, those trisomies don't really have much difference. The differences are very minor and don't really affect them too much as far as this gender, the sex chromosomes.
The reason that it happens is because you have one set of all of those genes typically, and then your sex chromosomes take one of each matching pair of chromosomes.
Yes, thank you.
Sometimes the splitting up doesn't work right. Every once in a while something breaks and 2 go one direction and none go the other direction for a given pair.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that was the question, sorry. So when the cell is dividing during meiosis, when the sperm and the egg is formed, sometimes one of the genes isn't taken over to one side and 2 are moved over to the other. I wish I had a picture of that here, but there is a picture later on, and I will try to address that at that time. Does that seem to answer your question? All right. So now, this shuffling with a heterozygous base, different genes on each chromosome for Adam and Eve, would match what we're seeing today. Much better than the evolutionary model, and we'll get into what the evolutionary model would expect to see today and how it does not match with what we see. We have a lot of variation within our genomes. Any one person holds about 1/3 of the world's genetic variation, meaning I hold about 1/3 of all the genes in humans within me right now. And any 5 random people can hold up to 90% of the world's genetic variation on average. So science has finally caught up to the Bible in this. We are very, very similar. Very little of us differ. Only a very small portion of our genes. So science has finally caught up to the Bible in this, that race is not a thing. We are a human race. There are different people groups with different genes, but those differences are very minor, very few. And they're not even localized to the people groups we usually expect. Take the epicanthic fold there in the top left, if you can see that. You can see one eye, and if you can't see that because of me there. But this we usually think of Asian populations, yet it is found in the Swedish population as well. You can see there a pair of twins, one with darker skin, one with lighter skin. This is another example of what I mentioned earlier, where parents can have in the same pregnancy the both extremes. We have attached and free earlobes, a number of differences, all of which are relatively minor. But the evolutionary explanation for this doesn't quite fit. We went over those 6 different genes that account for 30% of the observed skin color variation. Evolutionarily, the story for that is that lighter skinned people with less melanin would have been selected against in the tropics, but favored at higher latitudes. There are exceptions to this. that seem to disprove this because, for example, the Inuits. And let's look at this map of humans in the 1940s based upon skin color. You can see areas with darker skin and lighter skin. And our ancient DNA that we found shows that the lighter skin at the bottom of Africa used to occupy all of Africa until they were displaced further south due to something called the Bantu expansion. Now, the same pigment that's at the bottom later moved into the top but did not go around. This is a different people group, yet it's the same skin coloration. Evolutionary, this would require this to have evolved twice. Does not make sense to have the same thing evolve multiple times. Same thing for darker skin. Darker skin is found not only in Africa today, but also in the Australian Aborigines and other of the Melanesian island groups. This is the same dark skin in Africa. So this requires it to have evolved twice. Yet the biblical model makes much more sense of this. And Adam and Eve would have looked probably more brown eye, brown hair, brown skin. Now, Puerto Rico is one of the most genetically diverse places on Earth. They have the original islanders, Europeans, and slaves from the African slave trade. They've intermarried for a few hundred years now. Now, I'm not saying Adam and Eve would have looked Puerto Rican, but they would have looked closer to them than most other people groups today. Now, as far as why we have different people groups, it is mainly because of the dispersion of Babel. Geographical and cultural separation leads to genetic separation. Most people in human history have married someone born less than 10 miles away from them. I'm close to that. I married somebody who lived less than 10 miles away, but was not born less than 10 miles away. Now let's look at Terah's genealogy. Normally, Terah and the tribes of Israel, I'm talking about Reuben, Simeon, the heads of the tribes, the first of them, should share only about 3% of the DNA. Now, because of the inbreeding with Sarah and Abram, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah and Rachel, they're closer to about 22%. So instead of being closer to a great-great-grandchild, they are more similar to a grandchild. 10% of their genome would be homogeneous, meaning the same, having two copies of the same gene. And this would have happened to all these people groups. Remember, inbreeding was not frowned upon, was not told to not do that until the time of Moses. And even after that, it was common in a number of populations. In the 1800s for Europe, that's when it started to be frowned upon there. And still present in a number of Muslim communities. And remember, Moses was 2,500 years after creation and about 1,000 years after the flood. So all these people groups would have had genes selected for just from randomness, not from the environment, not from natural selection, but just any population that interbreeds within itself will statistically select against some and for others. And that's how we got the differences between the people groups today. And as far as inbreeding, the institution, saying that it shouldn't be done in Moses' time was probably because a lot of problems were starting to arise. God knew that this was going to be a case then and started to try and get people not to do that. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob and Rachel all had trouble conceiving. There may have been a genetic component to this. Same for Leah's weak eyes. Esau was hairy all over, and there is a known genetic mutation that could explain that. Polydactyly, mentioned in the Chronicles, people with 6 fingers and 6 toes. That is common, especially in communities that tend to interbreed amongst themselves and don't mix with other population groups. Now, from here on out, we're going to be focusing on ape and man genetics until we get to our last topic. And we're going to see if our current genome today and the ape's current genome today give any inclination that we are similar or related. The current evolutionary literature identifies chimpanzees as the closest living relative of humans. And evolutionists have placed the split about 3 to 17 million years ago. This depends on which evolutionary group, so you will get some people saying that it's orangutans or something else. But the majority do hold to something like this. And as far as the genetics go, there are some things that both models agree on. Both the biblical model and the evolutionary model would agree that apes and humans would have the most similarity compared to other animals and humans. Now, evolutionarily is because they're related. The biblical model is because of design characteristics. We are most similar to apes as far as design goes. We have similar forms, similar metabolisms, eat similar food, And because we do similar things, we would expect our design, our blueprints, to be similar. Not the same, but similar. Now, evolutionists will claim that humans and apes have 99% similarity in their genes. And remember, even if it was only 1%, this would not negate or contradict the biblical model. It doesn't matter. We are different. It doesn't matter if we are that similar, because we are dissimilar. We are similar based upon our similar designs, our similar features, our similar functions. But let's look a little closer at this paper. In 2005, a paper in Nature showed that 2.4 billion DNA letters between humans and chimps had a difference of about 1.23%. Yet to get that, they had to select against about a quarter of the human material and 18% of the chimp material, meaning they removed 25% of our genome and 18% of the chimp genome to get those 2.4 billion letters that they compared. So a total of 1.3 billion letters were removed from the two. Now let's continue further. Let's see if that 1% actually works with the evolutionary model. So we will assume that the average generation is about 20 years. That's a relatively young generation. Let's assume that, give the benefit of the doubt to the evolutionary theory. At 60 mutations each generation, that would produce about 150,000 to 650,000, resulting in 18 to 80 million different letters. Now, rounded down, humans and chimps have about 3 billion DNA letters, and evolutionists would expect about 1 to 3% genetic differences. Yet you can see there on the chart, if you use the previous time that they had, 4.5 to 7 million years ago as far as the divergence, it does not allow for the actual differences seen today between humans and chimps. It does not allow for that. They need more time. And so they gave themselves more time. Now they assume that it's 11 to 17. That's why previously I said 3 to 17 million years. But to push that back requires pushing other dates back. You can see there some other supposed dates that they had at the bottom. And this is all to fit that 1%. But there's another problem. Humans and chimps don't have the same amount of DNA. Rounded down, we both have about 3 billion. But in general, there is a difference of 50 to 134 million different letters as far as the amounts. Not just the differences between the letters, but total amounts are 50 to 134 million more in the chimps. So that means chimps have an extra 1.5 to 4.33% of DNA. That's not included in this 1%. So to get to 1%, they had to add on a number of million years. Now, just even if everything within us was the same as what is in apes, and apes just had a little extra, to get that little extra, they would still need to push back a number of other million years to get to that 4.3 potential there. So even if you just hook the totals, it does not fit this 1%. And other studies have been done. Roy Britton did a study where he included some more of the information that was excluded, not all, but more. And he found it to be about 4% difference between humans and apes. A number over twice, closer to 3 times, what they have previously been saying. If we were to take this 4%, we'd have to push that divergence back even further. And others, Jeffrey Tompkins, a creationist, said it came closer to about 12%. Now, other creationists will say that that's a bit too high, should be a little bit lower, but it doesn't matter. Even if it was 4%, it still does not fit what we are seeing today. And humans and apes are different in more than just the lettering of their genome. We're different with the Y chromosomes as well. You can see there a picture of the human and the chimp Y chromosome. Don't look very similar. In fact, about half of the chimp chromosome is absent compared to the human.
Which one is which?
The chimp is the smaller one. And so, even if you were to exclude half of that that's absent, we're still only 70% similar. That is, as an evolutionary paper said, man and something like a chicken. We are not similar at all as far as our Y chromosome. And remember, there is no shuffling with the Y chromosome. That means all the differences in that had to arise from mutation, and they just don't have enough time for that. So it does not seem that we have come from apes based upon our Y chromosome, not to mention the differences with the rest of our genome. And there's more. We have something called telomeres. They're little caps that go on the end of our chromosome. They help protect our chromosomes from damage. And with each duplication of the cell, the cap is reduced in size. You can see there, at the bottom left, how every time the cell divides, it does not replace that cap. Now, in our sex cells, the sperm and the egg, those caps are replaced, but not for the rest of the cells in our body. And this is one of the major components behind aging, we think, and may be an explanation for why, after the flood, humans began to age and die a lot sooner, not live as long. It may be because we're no longer able to replace these caps on the end of our chromosomes, or it may be one portion of it. Then the logarithmic decrease in that, the way that which the age is decreased, is a very natural change that we see. We expect things to change in that rate. And so it seems to match with what we're seeing here genetically. But that's beyond what we're talking about today. That's just FYI. So humans, their telomeres are actually shorter compared to all the other apes, meaning that to get a shorter telomere requires a number of changes that we don't yet understand. And yet that is one difference, is just the structure of the chromosome. Also gene expression. Even if we had the same genes, they are expressed differently. And as we went over before in the design lecture, there are a number of things that regulate this, from the genes themselves to the epigenetics and proteins and all this other stuff. And we even have differences in full genes. Looking at the 1, 4, 12% difference, it seems like we have the same genes, but they're just structured a little differently. No, we will have to require humans to get 689 more genes and apes to get 86 more genes, or lose some of those, depending on how you want to divvy it out, if the evolutionary theory were true. It is much harder to create or lose an entire gene than it is to alter a gene, evolutionarily speaking. So these are further problems.
With the gene expression, can you give us an example? What does that look like for a species to have more significant differences controlled by a gene difference?
Okay, so that is a difficult question to say. It's a very involved question. So the question is an example of how things can be regulated to have different functions. I can't think of one off the top of my head, just because I don't deal with gene expression myself a lot, but there are a lot of things that affect it. So you have other sections of DNA that when the DNA is bent, it can then act as binding sites for protein, mRNA, a number of things, and then that can cause a gene to be turned on or turned off more, be produced more. Certain bacteria will produce more or less depending on their environments, and that is one of the mechanisms for antibody resistance. I just don't know what protein or what gene that would be producing.
But bottom line, if they have one gene difference or one whatever, that's going to show a greater difference between two individual chimps than would in humans.
Yeah, so any minor difference genetically actually results in a major difference downstream, and that difference isn't just because of the change genetically. So even if you were to change that letter, it's not going to do anything further downstream because all that is still in place. Then that would also need to be changed. Does that seem to answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks.
I'm trying to explain this as simply as possible, but this material is not simple. So again, if you have any questions, which there seem to be a few, feel free to email me after class. Otherwise, feel free to text in during class. Now, the chromosome number is even different. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. That's including our sex chromosomes. Apes have 24 pairs. And this is something of a type 2 experiment, meaning that it doesn't matter if we do have a fused chromosome, because that's the evolutionary explanation for this. Biblically, it doesn't matter. The biblical model actually allows for this, and it is a prime suspicion for why some animals have speciated, meaning why a kind has split into a number of different species and why those species can no longer breed. Take, for example, horse and a donkey, mule. Chromosomal difference there. So differences, fusions and splits can occur. But the question is, do humans have a fusion in our chromosomes? the evolutionary theory requires this. So if this is not shown to be the case, this is a major push against the evolutionary theory. But if this is the case, it doesn't mean really anything for the biblical model. And so you'd expect to have a few things if you had two chromosomes fused together. For one, those telomeres, those caps. You'd expect to have two caps fused together in the center of the chromosome somewhere. And this they reported to have found, I should say. It's about 800 bases long. This was found in the 1990s. They would expect to have 99 to 100% of a TTA, TTG pattern. Those are just the letters of the genome, of DNA. Yet, they only find about a 70% TTA, TTG pattern. And in the middle of this is a switch for a gene, meaning that this is functional. This is not some sort of cryptic or fossil in the DNA. This is a functional piece of DNA, something that is involved with gene regulation and non-coding RNA. And it has a number of functions with it, meaning it's not something that can simply pop in easily. So this is a major push against a fusion site there for the telomeres. DNA would also the chromosome would have to have two centromeres there. And centromeres are where, if you look at the bottom left, where the cell attaches to the chromosomes and pulls them apart. So with the trisomies we were talking about before, like Klinefelters and such, at this stage, when the cell is dividing during meiosis, producing the sex cells, the sperm and the egg, one of the sides is not pulling apart the chromosome and two are going to the other side. This happens very rarely, but it does happen. Now, this happens in every cell. It doesn't matter as much in most of the cells of our body, but it does matter in our sperm and egg cells. Now, as far as the human chromosome 2, we'd expect to see two of these there if there was a fusion site. Because if you have two chromosomes that each have one, when you fuse them together, you'd expect to find two of them there. And they have reported to have found this as well. This is about 250,000 base pairs long. Yet, there are many interruptions within what they claim is the centromere. It has a large protein-coding gene within it that is actually part of the centromere. Again, meaning that it is functional. And so their fossil, which should not have any function in their genome, actually has function, meaning that it is not a centromere. If it was, they would have to have much more time to create that from mutations alone, and they just don't have that much time, even if it was possible. So there are a number of differences between human and apes as far as the genome goes. And the more we learn about our genomes, the more differences we see. And we do have some similarities. Like I said before, similar function, similar metabolism, similar shape would give similarities. Humans and mammals have similar metabolisms. So we have a lot more similarity than, say, with the Drosophila, which is a fruit fly, and chickens. We have about 60% between us and them. Now, these studies were done the same way that the 2005 paper was done. So they separated out some DNA with this. So it's probably not exactly these percentages, probably a little bit lower, but still. And then even if we were the same, the way they do these studies is by chopping up the DNA. They don't unravel it and compare it side by side, like you would two books to see if they have the same lettering. They chop up the DNA and use computer algorithms to compare the two. So as far as order, they don't really look at that. And order has a big component as far as genetic expression, as far as function, as far as how these genes work. Very similar to computer code. Very similar to our language today. If we rearrange the words in a sentence, it could mean something incredibly different, or gibberish. And so, if we take this into account, we're even vastly more different. Any questions on that from people online or anyone before we move on to the last topic?
I'm thinking, you compare it to our languages today, many languages have very close to the same number of letters. Mm-hmm. There is no understandability between them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what you're saying here. The order makes a ton of difference.
Yeah, as far as looking at languages today, there are about 100, depending on who you're looking at, different language groups. And that depends on, as far as the American languages, that have no connection. And this is very similar to what we're seeing genetically, meaning that we do have some languages that branch and merge, such as Latin and Spanish. If you know Spanish, you can learn ancient Latin relatively well, or modern Greek and ancient Greek. Differences, but some similarities. We see that today as far as the biblical kinds. One dog turning into multiple breeds of dogs, Chihuahua to Great Dane. But you're not going to get any connection between the dog and the cat the same way you're not going to get any connection with a number of these languages today. That's why they're called language groups. And there is no connection that we can get.
Even though they might have very similar sounds.
Yeah. I mean, we all have the same mouth, so we'll have to use the same sounds to some extent.
There are some sounds I cannot make.
Yes, there are some sounds that some people cannot make. If you try to learn Spanish and you can't trill your R's, I'm sorry. But that kind of leads us into our next topic. We are purposefully over-designed. And this is, really, I find this very convincing, very wonderful, and something that everybody can use because it doesn't require a lot of scientific understanding. Purposeful design basically says that we have the ability to do much more than survive. And there's too little time to develop this evolutionarily. There's no adequate mechanism for an evolutionary worldview to describe, to explain some of these over-designed features that humans have. One you may have noted is the brain. According to evolution, the human brain has survived or has evolved for survival tasks like hunting and gathering. Yet these tasks do not require the intellect that we have. You are far more smart than what you need to do to just hunt and gather. Far more intelligent. We can do a number of things, and they have even removed half a brain in a child because of medical reasons. They needed to do this. Yet that child appears basically normal. They can do a number of things, if not all the things, that they need to do to live in today's society by removing half of her brain, or their brain. I think it was a girl. We are able to do a number of intellectual activities that wouldn't explain their creation, their formation, if all we are doing to select for those is hunting and gathering, sciences, language, mathematics. The ability to do this arose relatively frequently in history. Both models agree on that. Yet the evolutionary model has to have some way of getting these genes, getting this function, to have changed rapidly in a short period of time. Biblically, though, we know that this ability was there entirely. It just took a number of generations to build up to the level that we have today, standing on the shoulders of giants, as a quote goes back. The next is the face. We have a wonderful face. You have a wonderful face. All human facial muscles must have been necessary for survival. Yet there's no explanation evolutionarily for why we have a smile or a frown, why everyone can do these facial expressions. They have to say it was advantageous for some reason, potentially for attracting mates. I mean, everyone likes a mate that will smile. You like it when your spouse smiles. Yet, why do you like it when your spouse smiles? This is another example of irreducible complexity. I mean, a number of animals can smile. Dogs can smile. When I go into work some days and I'm looking at a dog coming into me, sometimes it will pull back its lips, show its teeth, and just run at me as fast as it can. Now, many of you are probably expecting it to be snarling, and there are some differences, but it looks very similar to that. It is simply mimicking its owners. And for much of the animal world, that is a very aggressive expression. So why would we want a mate that has that expression? It does not make sense evolutionarily. And then, even then, it does not explain other less attractive facial features, such as frowning. Why is frowning, everyone's able to do that? Yet it does not apply any benefit, or at least not a strong enough benefit that would outcompete all the humans that couldn't frown. And we have 10,000 other facial expressions. If we had more time, maybe I would go through them, but I won't. And another semi-facial expression is crying. Apes do have tear ducts. They do lubricate their eyes. In fact, all mammals do. But humans are unique in that we cry as a response to emotion. This is very hard to argue evolutionarily. What benefit does crying because we are sad, because we are hurt, what benefit does that give us? That is a sign of weakness. Weakness is not good if you want to survive. Why would I care if you are crying? You are distracting the predator from me, so I can go somewhere else and you'll be eaten. That is good for me, but not good for you, not good for the person who's actually crying. Yet it is perfectly consistent with the biblical model, with a God creating man to be an emotional being. So next time you're crying and someone asks, why are you crying? You can say, because God created me to be an emotional being. It makes perfect sense. Next, speech. We already talked a little bit about languages, but just the ability of us to be able to communicate, understand, and actually speak verbally is wonderful. And again, this arose relatively frequently based upon the evolutionary model. Language itself, as far as written language, seems to have occurred relatively frequently with the biblical model, though we have been able to speak from day one, and there are some disagreements about when written language would have occurred.
Recently, frequently.
As far as from Adam alone or from after the flood. We only have evidence of written language about a few hundred years post-flood. Again, we don't have any records or references to writing before flood, but that's a discussion for another day. The very fact that we can write, the fact that we can understand and speak, is very hard to explain evolutionarily. Yet it makes perfect sense with the biblical model. God made us to be able to communicate with Him and with each other. In our hands, we have wonderful hands, able to do just incredible things. As we mentioned before, when comparing ape and human hands, the human hand is able to do a number of movements that apes just simply cannot do. In fact, a quarter of our entire human motor cortex, the part of our brain that controls our muscles, controls our hands. So a quarter of that. Yet the muscles in our hands are only about 10% of the muscles in our body. So we have a large amount of our brain functioning for our hands. Now, evolutionists propose that the hands resulted as a survival need, meaning to hold crude farming tools, throwing spears, bare-knuckle fighting. Yet, the things that you need to do those does not explain why we can do all the other things. Writing, surgery, carpentry, sports, playing musical instruments. The human ability to hold a pen with a tripod grip with your fingers like this is very hard to explain evolutionarily, let alone using chopsticks. And so it is difficult to explain these things evolutionarily, but makes perfect sense biblically. We were created being able to do all of these so that we could express ourselves, communicate, learn, all the things that God wanted us to do. And another thing about our hands is we have an incredible sensation of touch. Over 2,000 touch centers per centimeter squared. Our fingertips can feel the difference of a ridge in just 10 microns in width. That is a hundredth of a millimeter. We can feel that little bump there. We have a 2-point threshold, meaning we can tell 2 points apart at about 2 millimeters with our hands. Depending on the size of the body or location in the body, it's a little bit different, but our hands are one more sensitive. And this is better than sight can determine. We have an amazing sensation there. And it doesn't stop. Hair. Our hairline is remarkably neat around our neck and forehead. And this is very difficult to explain evolutionarily. Why is it almost every human has the same hairline? And those that don't have the same one, it's just slightly different. Maybe we should have hair going down our backs or going down our shoulders or something like that, but why? There's no real benefit to this. So why is it that every human has a very similar hairline? And another thing is the beard. Why do men have beards and women do not? Evolutionarily, this would require the men to all prefer a mate without a beard and the women to all prefer a mate with a beard. Generation after generation after generation after generation, all over the world. This does not make sense. This is statistically improbable to the point of impossibility, because why would they select a mate that doesn't have a beard or has a beard? It would make much more sense if we were like Tolkien's dwarves with also the women having beards. It doesn't make sense with men having beards and women not. So to summarize all this, Adam and Eve were created with all genetic variability we see with us today. In fact, probably more. With the flood and other people groups, unfortunately, probably dying out after the dispersion of Babel, we have less variety between us than what you might expect. We are remarkably similar, and all this came from Adam and Eve. Our Y chromosome and our mitochondrial DNA show a single male and female ancestor. And Puerto Ricans, being the most genetically diverse people groups, would probably have looked closer to Adam and Eve than most of the other extremes, but still not quite exactly like Adam and Eve. Humans and apes, their DNA is probably closer to about 12% than 1%, though there is still some disagreement on that exact percentage. But even if it's still 1%, it does not disprove the Bible, and it's still a problem for the evolutionary timeline. And this doesn't even take into account a number of the other differences, genetically speaking. And probably one of the best arguments for us being special, created, is the human ability to be over-designed. We just went through a few of those. And these are things that you can talk to anybody about because we all have experiences with these abilities. So if science, all this detailed math, numbers, genetics is not your thing, you can use your just very own abilities to explain how you were specially made. Again, if you have any questions about this material, let me know. Otherwise, that's all I have for you today. Thank you. And these are the resources. Sorry.